All right, everyone. Hey, welcome to another episode of Spectrum Cast. We are here with the cast of Spectrum Cast. We've got Tricia, Sean, and Randy as always. Great. Thanks for having everyone on today. Today we want to talk a little bit about architecting for a faster recovery. So clients who have typically gone through data protection, they probably got their backups okay, but how do I start thinking about architecting for faster recovery as SLAs start to change? We've had a lot of success having Sean lead us off. So Sean, why don't you take it away and start with some of the things that you think about or that clients think about with architecting for recovery?
Well, I mean, I guess you know me. I love to start out asking the questions, and I guess I'll throw it out to the group. What usually brings up this question with regard to clients? I mean, and I'll let somebody from the team maybe take that. What draws us into the situation as data protection experts when somebody says, "Hey, my recovery is not fast enough, and I need to architect it better or re-architect."
I think my first question is always going to be, well, what are you recovering from? Because when we talk about recovering, there's so many different scenarios. Is it just a hardware failure? Are you recovering from some type of malware? Or is this a full out IT center has been flooded type of restore that we're having to recover from? And that then dictates, okay, well, let's start talking about what you're going to need in place in order to do that. And yes, there is going to be overlap, but each of those scenarios kind of takes it deeper down into, have you thought about this?
For me, the have you thought about this is the critical question, because my question when somebody usually comes to me and asks me that is, well, what do you think your recovery was going to be, right? And how fast did you think it's going to be? And usually the first thing I find is there is a disconnect between the expectations of the people who are perhaps managing the organization or the people who are writing the checks for paying for data protection and recovery and the people who actually implemented it. Right?
And I mean, whenever I talk to customers and the the subject of kind of resiliency and data protection and reliability and recovery comes around, the consensus is always, backing up is easy. It can be complicated, but it's become fairly easy and fairly repeatable. Recovery, however, not so much, right? So it's like your classic insurance policy. You hope you never have to use it. So I guess from my perspective, as less kind of in the depths of this domain than you guys are, is first of all, how quickly is recovery necessary to minimize business impact? I mean, simply, what are the requirements for your RPO and RTO to minimize the impact on your business? And number two, what kind of investment is required to get you there? So you want to, I guess, architect not just for the speed and consistency and repeatability of your backup, but also your recovery objectives have to be designed in right up front, which I don't know that they always are.
Yeah, and I think it starts from the beginning where, and Sean, maybe back to your initial question is, we have seen customers who started out in the recovery side of the business as we back up every 24 hours. And if you need something back, we'll get it back to you in 24 hours. That was kind of the good enough kind of metric. And then all of a sudden we saw a lot of things around corporate compliance, whatever that may be. It might be a regulatory compliance, it might be corporate governance, no, I need to make sure I can get that data back and I have to respond to some sort of legal request and it has to be done within X period of time. And that period of time started driving requirements for the immediacy of recovering data. Then you move forward and what we started to see is now data, being the new oil as everybody calls it, right, is so necessary for all components of business. It's not just the ability to do my primary work function, but a lot of folks who have dove into the data reuse side of the business and would like to reuse data from that backup repository, because that's a great opportunity to get the latest and greatest copy of the most accurate data I have, needs to now be immediate. And then we fast forward to, okay, well, how do I do that? And the how do I do that comes down to what Randy was talking about, which is, I can back it up. I've kind of got that under control. But on the recovery side, if I'm not classifying my data and I don't know what data is where, and I'm not architecting it such that I can bring back specific components at a time at a particular pace, I'm probably going to lose the battle against quote unquote recovery, no matter who I'm trying to satisfy, right?
Steve, I like your point that kind of added to what I said. I kind of talked about disaster recovery, and you talked about compliance and data reuse. And you're right, those are even another perspective of what recovery can mean and things people have got to be planning for.
Well, and also the reuse aspect of it is important too. And I hadn't really thought about that before. Increasingly, that's part of the way you justify your investment in your data protection, infrastructure, right? Is that you can now reuse that data and extract more value potentially from data that might otherwise be just sitting idle. It's a way to, again, generate business value from the data that would otherwise be sitting idle. So that's a big consideration too. And I guess I also didn't really think about the fact that that also has a time sensitivity to it, right? So if you want to be able to spin up and down environments for DevOps or for production testing or, CI/CD or whatever, you want to be able to provision those environments quickly, right? You need to have a specific. So if I'm a developer and I want to test out a new, function or a new microservice, and it's going to take me 24 hours to spin up that environment for testing, kind of sort of defeats the purpose of the agility I'm trying to achieve.
In fact, it takes that product, to your point, Randy, from the beginning, from that insurance policy that is backup to now it's actually a tool I can utilize in my environment to help me drive application development.
And I guess we've kind of danced around the subject. A couple of us have called it an investment, right? It depends on how you look at it, whether it's an investment or a cost, right? But the cost of this, of all of these feature functions, needs to be reconciled against the value that they provide. And part of the value is the mandate that's coming down from corporate governments that says you will do this, right? And another part of the value, maybe as Steve said, is the data reuse aspects of it. So something that you can maybe use to justify the cost of meeting those corporate requirements.
Well, this goes back to a discussion we had a few weeks ago about not all data is created equal. And so in this planning for recovery, the customer has to look at what data do I want to be able to reuse? What data has to be kept long-term for data retention requirements? And what data do I have to be able to recover rapidly if there is some type of disaster? And those might be three different data sources and three different plans then on, okay, this is how I'm going to protect this system versus this system.
Yeah, so it sounds like it sort of sort of complicates the policy definition phase or the policy discussion. But again, the benefit of that additional level of complication is that it allows you to unlock, value in those data streams that might otherwise, again, kind of not be available to you. So, you got to look at it, Sean, to your point, you got to look at it as a cost benefit analysis, right? So yes, you may have to make some additional investments into your environment to support those use cases, but what are you getting back, on the back end in terms of your agility, your time to market, your competitive positioning? Pick one, right? And I think we heard this in the discussion, Steve, you and I had with the Predator guys, is that, companies that resell value add services around data protection and data reuse are really good at this. Like they're really good at helping customers quantify the value and the benefit in a bottom line sense that they get from reusing that data effectively. So that's definitely something that has to factor into all these kind of calculations and design decisions.
I was going to say disaster recovery too, right? I visited large internet shops or e-commerce, let's call them. I won't name any names, but they could tell you to the second how much downtime it costs them, right? If I'm down for 1 second, every second that I'm down, I lose $1 million US or whatever the number is. So for them, when they looked at the cost of data protection, disaster recovery, or data reuse, they knew exactly how to measure that.
And that's a good point, Sean. I think one of the things as a practitioner you need to understand there are kind of three things, I think, that play into the cost of my solution. Number one is cost of the software overall, right? What's the cost of the software? There are probably four things, right? There's the cost of the software that actually is the data mover that moves it from the primary storage to this backup repository. Cost number two is what is the backup repository and how much does that cost? And to Trish's point before, depending on what your recovery needs are, is it long-term retention? Is it operational recovery? What are we trying to do? That has a particular cost associated with it. Number three is the people cost, right? There's a human cost, and obviously you want to try to keep that as accurate as possible. And as vendors, no matter what no matter what company you go into, they always tell you, well, you don't understand my cost the way I do. But internally as a practitioner, you want to try to understand what your costs are for that. And number four, and most importantly to what you said, Sean, is what is your cost per downtime? Because if I can't quantify that, especially by division, right? Let's say a banking division whose external banking applications that are offline cost them more money than if, the CEO can't find his PowerPoint, those are different. But if you don't understand those, then architecting for recovery becomes a little bit more of a challenge. And these days, one size does not fit all.
And I would add to that the cost of regulatory requirements. If you can't produce that material, there's also fines that can be levied.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Yeah. Yep. And that all has to be factored in. And again, I think that's where, sort of the industry and the ecosystem around data protection and reuse has gotten really good at modeling those costs and modeling the benefits and the cost of downtime and the regulatory risk and compliance costs, into a model that makes sense. And I mean, you look at the growth of kind of the secondary data reuse segment of the market, and I'm sure I'm not describing it correctly, but that's a rapidly growing and evolving section of the market. There's, we have a big solution portfolio. There's startups, popping up all the time. So it's clearly something that's very important. And I think it's also something that is not just within the realm of like big Fortune 100 companies either. I mean, increasingly these smaller, more agile companies, these born in the web, on the web kind of companies are also factoring that in from the beginning, which is a good thing because it is an important part of the overall architecture.
Well, I know another cost that maybe this falls under the people cost, but the cost for practicing the DR scenarios or practicing the reuse scenarios. I mean, I remember out of Pittsburgh, a big electric company there, they would hold bi-yearly types of data disaster recovery scenarios, and that's a cost, but they saw that as critical, even though it's not a Fortune 400 company.
Yeah, well, and I mean, I think the tools, and again, you guys know this market a lot better than I do, but it seems like the tooling and instrumentation around data protection has also gotten a lot better and more sophisticated at modeling those recoveries. So you don't necessarily have to take your environment down, for real in some, meaningful period of time. You can actually pretty accurately and repeatably model those failure scenarios and those recovery scenarios and get a pretty good sense, for what to expect when the real thing happens. So, that's another area where innovation and kind of, brain power can help solve that problem too.
That's where I think a lot of the new snapshotting technologies that are utilized for data protection, not just a snapshot, because a snapshot doesn't typically go into an off-box repository for true off-box protection, but technologies that do that are being utilized for exactly what you say, DR testing, Randy, because then what happens is I don't need to call the entire workforce in on a Saturday, shut the environment down, and pray that by Monday I get it up and running. Right? I can come in on a weekend. I can test the snap. Did it come up? I can try to put it in a fenced-off environment. I'm not impacting production. Testing to see if it works. It works, great. Okay, I know I got the right set of procedures for that particular scenario. Let me try the next application. And when you properly classify your data in your business, you can start to incrementally do those tests, over the course of a month, and you can just kind of repeat the process. And it doesn't have to be every 6 months, right? That you're hoping a prayer that nothing changed too dramatically in the last 6 months that you're trying to recover something.
So I have a rhetorical question. What are like the top 3 things that a customer, practitioner, consultant, seller, tech seller, advisor, partner, what are the top 3 things that they should ask about or look for in a design for recoverability discussion? What are the top 3 important issues to consider?
I'd say the first is that
Go
flexibility to
ahead.
cover all of these scenarios, the data reuse, the
Mhm.
DR, the long-term retention.
Okay. So Sean, you get the second one. And if that was your first one, sorry, you got to talk faster.
Well, I mean, I think a lot of it depends on your perspective. And I think these types of holistic solutions are usually designed by a team, right? And so, I mean, my answer was going to be, as a technical person who specializes in Spectrum Protect, when you come in here, when I go into a customer and have to answer these questions, I'm typically looking at the technical details associated with Spectrum Protect. How much is the software going to cost? Where am I going to put the software? What kind of storage am I going to use, et cetera. But I think that's only one piece of the bigger picture, right?
Mhm. Steve,
Yeah, I would think
you're up.
I think you know me, right? I'm big on, and I've said it a couple of times, data classification, and not just data classification, but maybe business classification. It's hard for me to select a product, a front end product, a data moving product, as well as a back end repository of where that data is going to live, if I don't clearly understand what data I have, maybe what the data usage profile looks like. So something like, I know that 90% of my data, when asked to be recovered, is usually a piece of data that has been created or developed or something in the last 90 days. Okay, well then I can then tier that data to a particular platform. But if I don't have a clear understanding of what data is most important, what data is least important, what's the recoverability, back to our compliance thing, Tricia, what data needs to be on in a particular location for compliance. If I don't know that, it's going to be very hard for me to pick and then justify or identify the cost for the front end and the back end. And then once I have those, do people know how to operate it, right? Or, what do I have for a planning run book to be able to recover things?
So the top 3 things,
Now,
according to
Randy,
the
you got to
panel
do
of
the top
experts.
4. Come on, you can't get out of it.
Yeah, Randy.
Oh, okay. So, well, oh, sure. Now that like all the good answers have already been taken, but I guess if I had to add to this already pretty comprehensive list, I would say planning for the future, like architecting an environment that's open enough that it can adopt and adapt to new standards and new workloads and new use cases going forward without you having to fundamentally re-architect or sort of gut your environment and start over again. So I guess reusability or future proofing would be something that I would want to make sure was designed in from the beginning. So that makes the top 4 now. Flexibility, so an environment that's flexible enough to accommodate a variety of different scenarios, use cases, workloads, recovery requirements. The architectural considerations of cost, the benefits, the physical architecture, the logical architecture, how it's deployed, how it's going to be used, how you cost that out over time. The classification of data and information that feeds into this design process to make sure that you're not kind of over engineering your solution for data that may not have the same value as other parts of data within your environment. And then finally, just kind of this ability to create an environment that's open and adaptable enough that it can accommodate. And I guess if I had to pick an example of that, it would be something like engineering for containerization, which we've been talking a ton about lately, is as you develop your data protection strategy and environment and architecture design pattern, you got to figure that your application workloads are going to be increasingly evolving from sort of bare metal, old school type workloads to more virtualized to increasingly containerized and microservice based. And you've got to accommodate all of those within your data protection strategy. So,
Could I add one more, Randy?
no, can only be 4. No, I guess you can. Go ahead.
I'd like to actually pose this one as a question to well, especially Tricia and Sean, because they talk a lot with clients. Is all of those points make a lot of sense, but as we start to move into, we talked about architecting for the future and that sort of thing. We've talked about data reuse. The next question that comes into play is, who is accountable for the backup? Because in the old days, there was a data protection administrator. Then as data protection got to be a little bit more well understood, maybe in the backup process, maybe not so much the recovery, there was the storage admin who had to do all of these particular jobs. Now, what we're seeing when we're in the field is that developers, especially in the container space, they need to protect their environment. But they want to just have something and turn it on and not be bothered with talking to the storage administrator or the backup administrator. So now they have a little bit of accountability for that as well. And the question then becomes, how does everybody know who to talk to? How does that happen?
Yeah, that should probably be number one. Like before you can start having these conversations, you got to know who to invite, right?
And I think the answer to that is, unfortunately, it's a hot potato, right? I mean, I can't tell you how many customers I've gone to visit. You know, we've come up with all these things that you need to know, right? And I can't tell you. And the other complicated thing is, this need to know list is constantly evolving, right? Constantly changing, and very difficult to understand and very difficult to keep track of. And I can't tell you how many customers I visited where you go in and you start asking these questions, and there are no answers, right? That person didn't exist. That consulting engagement didn't exist. If it did, maybe it was done by a vendor who was not looking at the comprehensive solution, but only selling a piece or part of the solution, right? So it's not comprehensive. And that typically leads to them not being able to answer the question that you asked, Steve, and typically leads to the bad results that we're kind of dancing around here.
I think this is a leadership question. If corporate's not making this as important as their physical assets, you know, Randy, you said data's the new oil, then that's a failure in leadership to give this the high priority, to give this the money needed to be able to do this, and then to make a clear structure of who's in charge, who's doing it. So it's got to start from the top because data is so critical nowadays.
Yeah. If we turn,
now, I would add to you, Steve, too, that this is one of the appeals, at least, of the cloud, right? Because theoretically, when I'm working on the cloud, at least that was the vision when the cloud started. A lot of this stuff is thought about and taken care of for you, right? The Azure will never go down. AWS will never go down, right? So I really don't have to think about this stuff very much. Yeah. Unfortunately, I think with the complexity that has come with the cloud and the different layers of service, that is no longer the case anymore. But at least that's what started, or that was the hope.
It has also driven a lot more of the self-service kind of requirements. So back to, I think Trish, you said that like the practitioners don't want to have to go through the political and organizational hoops to do their work and do their job and get things done. They want to have access to the data and the information and the environments on their own, so they can kind of be more self-sufficient.
So if we want to unhot potatoize this, as you said, Sean, and we want to turn this around and give advice, I think I like Trish's answer probably the best from a hierarchical standpoint, is to ensure that the message gets up to the leadership that says, hey, we have this situation and it has to deal with our data, which is our most important asset. We need your help in driving all of the correct players in this space, as well as, once we make decisions, top-down rules that people need to engage by. You can't just turn on backup and hope that it's going to the right place or put it someplace. You have to enable these particular SLAs that are set by this particular department because it means this particular thing, right? And then make sure all that gets propagated down. Because I think if you don't, what ends up happening is something slips through the cracks, and whatever that something is, it ends up being the wrong thing, right? And it gets you in a lot of trouble, whether it's regulatory trouble or data loss trouble, or downtime issues which cost money, whatever it is, right? It ends up being expensive.
So I would kind of describe that as the document rule, right? Having somebody write this stuff down and having it to be a continuous stream of knowledge that lives in the entity despite the people that are there is is extremely important, right? And in
Yeah.
some of the best customers that we see, we do see that. In other customers, as you say, Steve, it's the bad event, right, that leads to the, oh my God, how did we get here, and what are we trying to do, and why are we trying to do it?
Sean,
Trial by fire.
where are we on the path around automating that process of documentation? Not the process of documenting actually what's happening, but automating the steps that need to happen to make my recovery life much simpler. Where are we in that life cycle?
So with the disaster recovery manager, that's been built into Spectrum Protect forever. And that's now being integrated into the operations center. But that's your Spectrum Protect server. And then we have our partner, Christy, who does bare metal restore and can really help automate the bringing back of the operations of the operating system, the device drivers, the networking, if it's not a VM or containerized system. But when you start talking about a corporate type of documentation, that's not in our product. You know, the corporate documentation.
I mean, we've seen, and that's, I'll be the nattering nabob of negativism here, because it seems like I always am, right? It seems like we have a lot of disparate technologies that have kind of put these thought into place. Information about classifying data, information about operational recovery like DRM and things like that. But I have not seen anything other than, quote, brain power, right, and hard work that has pulled all of those technologies together and put them in one place that somebody understands and somebody can use. That's my
Well, and as a caveat, I will
cents.
say, yes, we all do work for IBM, and we will hope that there would be an IBM solution that would do this. But even if there isn't, because I'm a big believer in the fact that there is no one vendor or one solution that can kind of solve all of the challenges when it comes to protecting information. There's so many things out there, so many rules, so many regulations, so many data use cases, et cetera, that it becomes difficult, right? So go ahead, Randy.
Sorry, Steve. I
No,
was
it's
just going
okay.
to say, it seems like we are making progress away from, maybe 10 years ago, or maybe even less than that, where like and Sean, you probably can speak to this better than I can, but like every customer you walk into has what amounts to kind of a bespoke environment for data protection. Like they're similar, but they're so different that they can't really be treated as a homogenous group, right? Everybody kind of does their own thing and has their own requirements and has their own specific policies in place, which makes it pretty difficult to standardize and to develop an open set of standards. Now, I will say, from my perspective, that as we continue the march towards more containerization and microservices and serverless computing and things we were talking about a few minutes ago, that's changing a little bit, because those standards are forcing companies to adopt a more standardized, for lack of a better word, approach to these things, right? So it's kind of forcing the issue a little bit, which is good and bad, right? I mean, it's good in the sense that it creates an environment that more people can communicate and understand, and it mitigates the Joe, the backup admin, getting hit by a bus risk factor. But it also adds some complexity and adds skills that people need to develop and invest in. So it's, as always, it's kind of a cost benefit analysis, but it does seem like it is improving as we move more into these containerized and microservices type environments.
But it still just leaves the fact that each customer has to document their own requirements. What is the most critical system get a backup first? What is whatever the parameters are that are critical for that customer, those have to be in a place that is documented, accessible. And then if their Spectrum Protect admin isn't available, then they can pull in someone from services or whatever. But you've got to have the base document out there, and that's going to be up to each customer.
See, and I would say, Steve, that IBM is probably one of the better companies that can help customers with this, because it's not a magic tool that comes in there and does it that solves these problems, right? It's taking all of the disparate tools that IBM has in its arsenal, putting them together in some sort of logical sense that meets a need, meets a business need, along with the consultative selling, the consulting that helps you do that. And you know, more than a lot of vendors, because we offer a holistic solution, or at least a lot of the pieces and parts, we're in a position to do that, as opposed to a vendor who's just selling you one tool that's going to, quote, solve the problem, right?
Well, and data retention brings up the whole other problem of maybe I archived this off 10 years ago and gee, I don't have that operating system and that's out of date. So that's a whole nother problem of trying to recover older data that might be required for something. We could
Which gets back to the whole kind of finger architecting for, you know, future developments or future and past, right? So to your point, if you've got protocols or, you know, access methods that are no longer valid or no longer supported, you've got to be able to recreate that environment in at least a sufficient enough way to recover the data. So that's a good point.
So Sean, maybe all of this leads us into our nice close, and you can maybe educate us on, does TechU have anything that can help IT practitioners or data protection practitioners as we move off here?
TechU plug time.
I'm glad you asked that question, Steve. Next week, we're going into Technical University, and there are a lot of good sessions that work at all of these various different levels, right? There's sessions about the technology, the underlying technology that can be used to build a solution and to build a disaster recovery solution and to help architect your fastest recovery. And there are a lot of higher level sessions that are more about what's the strategy going forward, what strategy should you be using to do this, things along those lines. So I would encourage everybody to sign up for Technical University and take advantage of those resources to help at least build a bigger picture of what's available and how you can address it. You obviously are not going to come out from this vlog with all the answers, right? And I don't think you're going to come out of TechU with all the answers. Yeah, you have some pieces to put together. Let's put it that way. So I highly commend that to you.
Very good. Thank you very much. So I think next week, everyone, we're going to take a break and we're going to let all the folks who want to attend TechU go to TechU. And I know a bunch of us have different sessions there, so we want to be available for that. So we're going to skip next week. The week after, we're actually going to bring on IT practitioner, take this the next level down and kind of deal with some of the questions that folks are hearing when it comes to architecting their backup for different types of recovery. So looking forward to that. Fraser McIntosh, who's one of our lead architects in data protection space, is going to join us, and we'll look forward to that. So with that, I want to thank everyone, Tricia, Sean, Randy. Appreciate it. It was a great conversation today, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks.